The lake water was a shock of cold, a liquid vice squeezing the air from her 9-year-old lungs. Maya didn't think, she just moved. One moment she was sitting on the splintered dock, dangling her bare feet over the murky green surface, the only place she could find quiet. The next, a violent splash 20 yards out, where the big man had been swimming. His head went under, came up sputtering, then went under again. He was flailing, a clumsy, panicked dance of a body betraying its owner. No one else was there. The Carters had dropped her off hours ago with a dry sandwich and a command not to wander. They wouldn't be back until dusk. No one was coming. The thought was as cold as the water. She kicked off the dock, her thin dress instantly heavy, clinging to her like a shroud. The water was colder than she'd imagined, a deep, primal cold that stole her breath. She forced her head up, gasping, her eyes fixed on the spot where he'd disappeared. A swirl of bubbles broke the surface. He was big, a mountain of a man she'd seen roar up to the small lakeside parking lot on a motorcycle that sounded like thunder. He'd nodded at her, a gesture so small but so rare in her life that she'd memorized the gray in his beard and the tired kindness in his eyes. He was wearing cut-off denim shorts, but he'd left his leather vest on the shore. She could see it from the water, a black square with a strange, winged skull stitched on the back. Her arms and legs, scrawny but strong from endless chores, churned, felt like swimming through mud. The waterlogged dress pulled at her, a constant, dragging weight. She reached the spot, her own lungs starting to burn. He came up again right beside her, his face a mask of purple terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. His eyes were wide, unseeing. He grabbed instinctively, his huge hand clamping onto her shoulder, pushing her under. Panic flared in her chest, hot and sharp. The world became a blur of green and bubbles. She couldn't breathe. His weight was immense, an anchor pulling her down to the silted bottom. But in the submerged chaos, a voice, her own small and steady inside her head, spoke with absolute clarity. Let the air out. Go limp. It was a trick she'd learned from a nature show, back in a better house, a better time. She relaxed her body, letting the last of her air escape. The man's grip, seeking purchase, slipped. For a second, she was free. She kicked hard, rocketing to the surface, and took a huge, ragged gasp of air. He was still there, sinking again. She went back under, this time with a plan. She swam behind him, wrapping her skinny arms around his chest from the back, locking her fingers together. She hooked her chin over his shoulder, keeping his face and her own just above the waterline. He was a dead weight, a colossal, water-filled stone. Kick, she grunted, the word a painful rasp. You have to kick, he didn't respond. He was barely conscious. Her own legs were starting to cramp, the cold seeping into her bones. She could feel her strength failing, the shore an impossible distance away. She was going to die here with this stranger, in the middle of a lonely lake on a Tuesday afternoon. The thought didn't bring terror, only a profound, hollow sadness. She adjusted her grip, her cheek pressed against the rough texture of his beard. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking. Kick, a flicker, a slight movement in his powerful legs. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was hope. She focused on that small flutter, pouring every last ounce of her will into the slow, agonizing journey back to the dock. The world returned in fragments of sound and light. The rough scrape of wood against his back, the thin, reedy sound of a child's desperate panting, the distant wail of a siren. He coughed, a violent, hacking spasm that expelled a lungful of lake water onto the splintered planks of the dock. His name was Arthur Jensen, but no one had called him that in 30 years. He was Bear, president of the San Bernardino Charter. His vision swam, a watercolor blur of blue sky and the small, pale face of a girl with wide, terrified eyes staring down at him. She was shivering, wrapped in his leather cut, the heavy vest absurdly large on her tiny frame. It was the last thing he remembered seeing before the cramp had seized his leg and pulled him under. The girl on the dock and his vest on the shore. He tried to sit up, but a paramedic gently pushed him back down. Easy there, big guy. You took on a lot of water. Another voice, sharp and bureaucratic, cut through the haze. Maya, for heaven's sake, get away from him. You're soaking wet and you've caused enough trouble for one day. Bear turned his head. A woman in a drab pantsuit with a clipboard stood a few feet away, her face a pinched mask of disapproval. Her eyes were on the girl, Maya, who flinched and pulled the heavy vest tighter around herself, as if for protection. The girl, Bear rasped, his throat raw. She pulled me out, the paramedic nodded. She's a tough little squirt. Kept your head above water until we got here. You're a lucky man. The woman with the clipboard, Ms. Albright from Child and Family Services, sighed with theatrical impatience. She shouldn't have been in the water at all. This is exactly the kind of reckless behavior we've been talking about. The Carters will be here any minute at the name Carters. The girl's posture changed. It was a subtle shift, a hollowing out, as if a string inside her had been cut. She stared at the ground, her small shoulders slumping. Bear saw it. Even through the fog of near drowning, he saw it clearly. It was the look of a pup that had been kicked too many times. She saved my life, Bear said, his voice gaining a low rumble of authority. He pushed himself up on his elbows, ignoring the paramedic's protest. He looked directly at Ms. Albright. Where are her parents? Ms. Albright sniffed, a dismissive, unpleasant sound. She's a foster placement. Her guardians, the Carters, are on their way. They are very responsible people who are providing her with a structured environment. An environment she seems determined to disrupt. They left her here alone, Bear stated. It wasn't a question. They allow her supervised recreation, the woman corrected, her tone icy. It seems Maya broke the rules. Again. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to speak with my client. She stepped toward Maya, reaching for her arm. Come on, Maya. Let's get you out of that ridiculous thing. As her fingers brushed the leather, Bear's voice cracked through the air like a bullwhip. Don't touch my property. Every head turned. The paramedics froze. Ms. Albright recoiled as if stung. The authority in his voice was absolute, an ancient power that had nothing to do with clipboards or regulations. He looked at the shivering child huddled inside the leather emblazoned with the club's colors. A life debt. The old rules were clear. His life had been saved. That debt now extended to the savior. He saw the bruises, faint but undeniable, wringing her wrist as the sleeve of her wet dress slipped down. He saw the way she didn't meet anyone's eyes. He saw everything. The vest stays with her, Bear said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of an oath. And so do I. Maya's world was the size of an attic room. The ceiling slanted so sharply that she could only stand upright in the very center. A small, grimy circular window looked out onto the back of the neighbor's garage. Her bed was a stained mattress on the floor, her blanket a thin, scratchy wool thing that smelled of mothballs. She had one small box that held everything she owned. A change of clothes, a worn copy of a book about stars she'd found in a dumpster, and a small, smooth gray stone she'd picked up from the shore of the lake that day. It was still damp. She had been sent to her room without dinner. Her punishment for creating a spectacle and ruining Mrs. Carter's afternoon. She could hear them downstairs, their voices a low, angry murmur, the television blaring. Hunger was a familiar companion, a dull ache in her stomach she had learned to ignore. The Carters believed in discipline. Discipline meant one meal a day, usually a bowl of thin oatmeal in the morning. Discipline meant chores from the moment she got home from school until she was sent to her room. Discipline meant you didn't speak unless spoken to, and you never, ever complained. The lake had been a mistake. Mr. Carter had a rare day off and had wanted to go fishing, and Mrs. Carter refused to stay home and babysit, so they had taken her along, dropping her at the public dock with a bottle of water and the stale sandwich. Don't talk to anyone, and don't move from this spot, Mrs. Carter had ordered, her finger jabbing the air. We don't want any calls. They were always worried about calls. Calls from school, calls from neighbors, calls from Ms. Albright. They coached her on what to say. Yes, I'm very happy here. Yes, they feed me plenty. No, these bruises are from playing. I'm very clumsy. She had learned the script by heart. She sat on the mattress, tracing the constellations in her book with a finger. Outside, a car door slammed. Heavy footsteps on the porch. She heard the doorbell, then Mr. Carter's angry voice. "What do you want?" A different voice, low and gravelly, answered. The voice from the lake. "I'm here to see the girl." Maya scrambled to the top of the stairs, peering through the banisters. It was him, Bear. He was wearing jeans and a black t-shirt that stretched tight across his massive chest. He looked even bigger standing in the Carter's cramped doorway. Behind him stood another man, leaner, with a sharp, intelligent face, holding a slim briefcase. "She's not seeing anyone," Mr. Carter snarled. "She's being punished. Now get off my property before I call the cops." Bear didn't move. He just looked past Mr. Carter, his eyes scanning the dingy hallway. "That's your right," he said calmly. "But we'll wait. My friend here, Deacon, is a lawyer. He's just filed a petition for a wellness check. So the police will be coming one way or another. It's just a matter of whether they come for you, or for us." Mrs. Carter appeared behind her husband, her face pale. "This is harassment," Ms. Albright assured us. "Ms. Albright works for a system." The lawyer, Deacon, interrupted smoothly. "A system that has, by my count, failed to follow up on 3 separate anonymous complaints regarding this address in the last 6 months. A system that is about to come under intense scrutiny from her hiding place." Maya saw Mr. Carter's blustering anger deflate, replaced by a pasty, fearful sweat. The foundation of their petty tyranny, their belief that no one was watching and no one cared, was cracking right before her eyes. The big man's gaze lifted, and for a second, it felt like he was looking right at her, through the walls, through the darkness. He knew she was there. He had come back for her. Bear sat in the passenger seat of Deacon's sedan, parked across the street from the Carter's house. The lights were on inside, casting yellow, sickly squares onto the overgrown lawn. He'd left a man, Slate, watching the house from an unmarked van a block away, just in case. His body ached. The doctors had wanted to keep him overnight for observation, but he'd refused. There were more important things than bruised ribs and waterlogged lungs. He couldn't shake the image of the girl, Maya, so small and so fierce, fighting to keep his head above the water. And he couldn't shake the image of the fear in her eyes when the social worker had mentioned the Carters. "They're scum," Deacon said, breaking the silence. He was reviewing documents on a tablet, his face illuminated by the cool blue light. "Foster care payments for Maya are $2,000 a month, plus a special needs supplement another $500, for a behavioral disorder they claim she has. Bank statements show they spend maybe $200 a month on groceries. The mortgage is paid, the car is paid off. The rest goes to a gambling account in Mr. Carter's name." Bear's knuckles whitened as he gripped the dashboard. It was a familiar story. People who saw children as paychecks. Parasites feeding on the most vulnerable. "The complaints?" Bear asked, his voice tight. "First one was from a teacher 6 months ago. Noted Maya was consistently underweight, hoarding food from the cafeteria. Second was a neighbor, 4 months ago. Reported excessive shouting and the girl being forced to do yard work in extreme heat. Third was 2 weeks ago, another neighbor. Heard crying late at night. All 3 were logged by Albright. All 3 were closed with the note. Family interview conducted. Allegations unfounded. Child is thriving." Bear closed his eyes. Thriving. That hollowed-out little girl was thriving. The system wasn't just failing. It was actively protecting the abusers. It was easier to close a case than to investigate it. It was easier to believe the well-rehearsed lies of adults than the silent terror of a child. "I called Albright's supervisor," Deacon continued. "Gave her the professional courtesy of a heads-up. Quoted the relevant state welfare codes they were violating. She told me it was an internal matter and to stop making threats." "It wasn't a threat," Bear rumbled. "It was a promise." He thought of his own daughter, grown now with kids of her own. He thought of the fierce, almost suffocating love he felt for his grandchildren. What if it were one of them? The thought was a hot spike in his gut. The life debt was one thing. That was club business and ironclad rule. But this was something else. This was personal. This was a child being systematically crushed, and the world was looking the other way. His phone buzzed. It was Slate. "We got a problem." Carter just dragged the girl out to the garage. He's got a belt in his hand. A cold, sharp rage, cleaner and more potent than any adrenaline rush, flooded Bear's system. The time for quiet observation was over. The system had been given its chance to work, and it had failed. Now they would do it their way. By the book, as Deacon insisted, but it would be their book. He looked at Deacon, whose face was grim in the glow of the tablet. "Make the call," Bear said. Deacon nodded, his thumb already hovering over a contact on his phone. "Church is in session," he said, and pressed the screen. The signal went out. A single, coded message sent to a dozen key members. From there, it would ripple outward, a call to arms disguised as a request for a meeting. Bear got out of the car and looked at the sad, peeling paint of the house where a little girl was being terrorized. The fear was a poison spreading through that house. But the antidote was coming, and it would arrive on 2 wheels, wrapped in leather and fueled by righteous anger. The clubhouse smelled of stale beer, old leather, and engine oil. It was a scent Bear usually found comforting, the smell of home. Tonight, it felt like the inside of a storm cloud, charged and heavy. They sat around the long, scarred wooden table, the chapter's inner circle. Road captains, the sergeant-at-arms, the treasurer. Men with names like Reaper, Preacher, and Tiny. They were silent, their faces hard, waiting for their president to speak. The meeting had been called under the club's most serious protocol, church. No prospects, no associates, just patched members. Bear stood at the head of the table, his shadow looming large on the wall behind him. The charter, their code of conduct, hung in a frame on that wall. "I'm alive tonight because of a 9-year-old girl," he began, his voice low but filling the room. "A girl who weighs maybe 60 pounds. She jumped into a lake and pulled my 280-pound ass to shore." A murmur went through the room. Respect. A life debt was the heaviest obligation in their world. "Her name is Maya. She's a foster kid. The people she lives with, the Carters, are collecting $2,500 a month to house her. They feed her once a day. They beat her. They've got her living in an attic. Tonight, the man of the house took a belt to her because she caused a scene by saving my life." The air in the room turned to ice. These were hard men. They had lived lives on the frayed edges of society. But there was a line, a bright, burning, absolute line, and the Carters had just stomped all over it. "Deacon has the paperwork," Bear continued, gesturing to the lawyer, who sat at his right. "Complaints ignored. A social worker covering her own ass. A system that's letting this little girl fall through the cracks until she disappears completely." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He looked from face to face, meeting the eyes of every man at the table. "The club owes a life debt. That debt is to her. And we will pay it." "What's the play, Prez?" asked Reaper, his voice a low growl. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the table. "We could pay the Carters a visit." "A real visit?" Bear shook his head. "No. That's what they expect. That's what they can use against us. It would solve the problem for one night, but it wouldn't save her. It would just make her the ward of a violent biker gang. We do this Deacon's way." By the book, Deacon stood up, opening a file. "The play is exposure. The system is failing because no one is watching. Tomorrow we make them watch. We are not a gang. We are a community organization. We are concerned citizens exercising our right to assembly. We will be disciplined. We will be silent. We will be lawful. But we will be seen." "And the girl?" Preacher asked, his face etched with concern. "I filed an emergency ex parte motion for temporary custody an hour ago, citing imminent danger," Deacon said. "It'll be on Judge Miller's desk at 8 a.m. I'm citing Bear and his wife Sarah as guardians. I've attached their financials, their clean records, and a sworn affidavit from Bear about today's events. But a judge won't sign that without overwhelming cause. Our job tomorrow is to provide that cause. Publicly." Undeniably, Bear looked at his men. He saw the fury in their eyes, but he also saw the discipline he had cultivated for years. This wasn't a call for violence. It was a call for protection. It was a call to bring their collective strength, their intimidating presence, to bear not on a person, but on a system. She saved the president, Bear said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but carrying the force of a command. The club will save the child. Get the word out. All charters within 100 miles. We ride tomorrow. Sunrise, the decision was made. The catalyst had been triggered. Emotion was now being forged into a plan. A quiet nod passed from man to man. The room emptied out, the men moving with purpose, their anger now channeled into a cold, methodical resolve. The storm was about to break. For 30, the first call was made from a payphone outside a 24-hour diner in Victorville. The message was simple. Church at San Bernardino. Sunrise, the man on the receiving end, the president of the High Desert Charter, simply said, "We're on our way." He hung up and started his own call tree. The message rippled outward through the sleeping suburbs and desolate desert towns. 5:15. In a garage in Riverside, a man named Slate was checking his equipment. Not guns or knives. Cameras. For small, high-definition GoPros, a DSLR with a telephoto lens, and 2 audio recorders disguised as key fobs. He formatted the memory cards, charged the batteries. He was the club's historian, their archivist. His job was to document. Truth was a weapon and Slate was an armorer. 5:45. Deacon was on the phone with a reporter from the local newspaper he'd known for years. "I can't give you details, Maggie," he said, his voice calm and professional. "But if you want a story about systemic failure at DCFS, be at their downtown office at 8:30 a.m. and bring a camera crew. You'll know it when you see it." He made a second call to a freelance journalist who ran a popular online news blog, known for its unfiltered coverage. 6:30. The sound began, a low, distant rumble that grew steadily. From the east, the west, the north, the distinct, staggered thunder of V-twin engines. They converged on a predetermined staging area, the vast, empty parking lot of a derelict shopping mall on the outskirts of San Bernardino. First, there were 20 bikes, then 50. They parked in neat, orderly rows, engines idling for a moment before being cut, leaving an almost reverent silence broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. By 7:15, there were 93 motorcycles. Men and a few women, members of 5 different charters, stood in quiet groups, sipping coffee from thermoses. There was no loud talk, no bravado. Their faces were set, their eyes focused. They adjusted their cuts, the leather creaking in the cool morning air. Bear arrived, not on his bike, but in Deacon's sedan. He got out and stood on the hood of the car to address the assembly. He didn't shout. His voice carried in the stillness. "Today we are not a club. We are a single voice," he said, his gaze sweeping over the sea of leather and steel. "We are here for a child. No one breaks ranks. No one speaks to the police unless Deacon is present. No one speaks to the media. We will be silent. We will be disciplined. Our presence is our statement. Let the world see who we are and why we are here." A low murmur of hooah rolled through the crowd. It was a sound of unified assent, of an army ready for its orders. 7:45. The signal was given. 93 engines roared to life in a single, deafening concussion of sound that shook the ground. Slate, positioned on a nearby overpass, captured the image. A long, winding river of chrome and black leather pulling out of the parking lot in a perfect 2x2 formation. A disciplined, mechanized column of silent fury. The mobilization was complete. 93 bikes, 112 members. One purpose. The procession moved not with the reckless speed of a gang, but with the deliberate, inexorable pace of a funeral procession. A funeral for apathy. The first sign of their arrival was not the sound, but the vibration. A low, deep hum that resonated in the concrete of the sidewalks and the plate glass windows of the downtown buildings. Then came the noise. Not a chaotic roar, but the synchronized rhythmic pulse of nearly 100 powerful engines moving as one. At 8:29 a.m., the lead bikes of the procession turned onto the street, where the Department of Child and Family Services had its headquarters. Ms. Albright was just getting out of her car, balancing a coffee and a briefcase, complaining to a coworker about her caseload. She looked up, annoyed by the noise, and her face went blank with disbelief. The column of motorcycles flowed onto the street like a black river. They didn't block the road. With practiced military precision, they peeled off one by one, filling every legal parking space on both sides of the street for 3 city blocks. The riders dismounted in near unison. Engines were cut. The sudden, profound silence was more intimidating than the noise had been. 112 men and women in leather vests stood by their machines, facing the building. They did not speak. They did not move. They simply stood, their arms crossed, a silent, unblinking army of witnesses. Pedestrians stopped and stared, pulling out their phones. Cars slowed, the drivers' faces a mixture of fear and awe. Within minutes, 2 news vans, sirens off, pulled up at the end of the block. Maggie, the reporter Deacon had called, was already out and directing her cameraman. "Get a wide shot," she commanded, her voice hushed. "Pan across their faces." All of them inside the DCFS building, work ground to a halt. Employees crowded the windows, their faces pressed against the glass. The director of the department, a man named Peterson, came out of his office, his face flushed. "What in God's name is going on?" he demanded. Ms. Albright stood frozen on the sidewalk, her coffee forgotten, dripping from her hand onto the pavement. She was surrounded, not by a physical barrier, but by a wall of silent judgment. She tried to push through a gap between 2 of the bikers, her voice a reedy squeak. "Excuse me, I have to get to work." The 2 men, one of them the size of a refrigerator, didn't even look at her. They simply stood their ground, immovable as granite. She was trapped. Deacon and Bear walked calmly through the ranks of their brothers and sisters. The sea of leather parted for them and closed just as quickly behind them. They stopped directly in front of Ms. Albright. Bear was a full foot taller than her, his shadow covering her completely. He said nothing. He just looked down at her, his face devoid of expression. Deacon, however, smiled, a thin, clinical smile. "Ms. Albright," he said, his voice pleasant but edged with steel. "Mr. Peterson, the department director, is expecting us. I believe you're wanted in the meeting as well. We have some files to review." Fear, stark and undisguised, finally broke through her professional veneer. She looked from Deacon's smiling face to Bear's stony gaze, then at the endless line of silent figures stretching down the street. The system that had protected her, the anonymity of her desk and her paperwork, had vanished. She was exposed, and the whole world was watching. The emergency meeting was held in a glass-walled conference room on the top floor, a space usually reserved for celebrating successes. Today it felt like an interrogation chamber. Director Peterson sat at the head of the table, his face pale and sweating. Ms. Albright was next to him, visibly trembling, unable to look anyone in the eye. Bear and Deacon sat opposite them. Through the glass, they could see the entire office floor, filled with silent, watching employees. Beyond them, through the large exterior windows, the silent legion of bikers stood sentinel 3 stories below. The city was their witness. "Let's be clear about why we're here," Deacon began, opening his briefcase and placing a thick file on the table. "We are here because a child, Maya, a ward of your department, is in imminent danger due to gross negligence and what appears to be a systemic effort to ignore credible reports of abuse." Peterson started to bluster. "Now, hold on, my department has an exemplary record." "Does it?" Deacon interrupted, sliding a photograph across the table. It was a high-resolution image, taken by Slate with his telephoto lens the night before, through a gap in the garage door. It showed Mr. Carter standing over Maya, his face contorted in rage, a leather belt raised in his hand. The photo was damning, undeniable. Peterson stared at it, speechless. "This was taken at 7:14 p.m. yesterday evening," Deacon said coolly. 45 minutes after you personally received a call from me warning of this exact possibility." He slid another document across. Here are the phone records. And here, he added a small audio player, is a recording of your social worker, Ms. Albright, dismissing the concerns of the paramedics at the scene yesterday. He pressed play. Albright's sharp, dismissive voice filled the silent room. She shouldn't have been in the water at all. This is exactly the kind of reckless behavior we've been talking about. They are very responsible people. Ms. Albright made a small, choked sound. Deacon wasn't finished. He produced another set of photos, these taken by a club member who'd posed as a utility worker. They showed the attic room, the stained mattress, the single, grimy window. This is where your thriving child sleeps, he said softly. Then came the final blow. Over the past several hours, Deacon said, looking directly at Peterson, several of our members, who happened to be neighbors of the Carters, decided they felt safe enough to come forward. They have provided sworn statements. He placed a stack of notarized affidavits on the table. Testimony of screaming, of the child being locked outside for hours, of Mr. Carter's gambling debts and Mrs. Carter's drinking. All things that a competent investigation, the kind Ms. Albright claimed to have conducted 3 separate times, would have uncovered. The mask didn't just drop. It shattered. Director Peterson looked at Ms. Albright, his face a mixture of fury and horror. He finally understood. This wasn't about a biker gang. This was about his department, his responsibility, his career, which was now burning down around him on live television. Ms. Albright began to weep, not tears of remorse, but of self-pity. I have so many cases, she whimpered. The paperwork. I didn't think. Bear spoke for the first time, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through her excuses. You didn't think, he repeated. A child is beaten and starved under your watch, and you didn't think. He leaned forward, his massive forearms resting on the table. Her name is Maya, and you will never forget it. The truth was out, laid bare on the polished conference table, illuminated by the flashing lights of the news cameras below. The system, when pushed into the glaring light of public accountability, moved with astonishing speed. Director Peterson, seeing the full scope of the disaster and the media firestorm erupting outside his window, made a call. 20 minutes later, a stern, no-nonsense family court judge named Maria Miller was on a conference call, her voice crackling with authority through the speakerphone on the table. I have your motion, Mr. Deacon, she said, and I'm looking at live news coverage of what appears to be half the motorcycle population of Southern California parked outside the DCFS building. You have my full attention. Deacon, calm and precise, walked her through the evidence. The photographs, the audio, the sworn affidavits from the neighbors, the documented history of ignored complaints. He articulated the clear and present danger to the child. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Bear held his breath. Everything hinged on this moment. Director Peterson. The judge's voice was sharp as broken glass. Is Ms. Albright in the room? Yes, Your Honor, Peterson squeaked. Ms. Albright, are the allegations presented by counsel accurate? That you closed 3 separate abuse complaints against the Carter household without a proper field investigation? A muffled sob was the only answer. I'll take that as a yes, Judge Miller said, her voice dripping with contempt. Consider yourself on administrative leave as of this second. Director Peterson, I expect a full internal investigation on my desk by Monday, or I will authorize one myself. As for the child, another pause. I am signing an emergency removal order, effective immediately. 2 sheriff's deputies are en route to the Carter residence to take Mr. and Mrs. Carter into custody pending felony child endangerment charges. Another unit will meet a DCFS representative at the child school. She is not to go home, Your Honor, Deacon interjected smoothly. Regarding placement, my client, Mr. Arthur Jensen, and his wife, Sarah Jensen, are prepared to take emergency guardianship. Their paperwork is in the file. The president of a motorcycle club? The judge asked, a note of skepticism in her voice. The man whose life she saved, Your Honor, Deacon corrected. A man with a stable home, no criminal record, a successful business, and a wife who is a retired pediatric nurse. They are, by any measure, More qualified than the department's last choice, the logic was inescapable. The system had failed so catastrophically that the Hells Angels were now the most stable option. Motion granted, the judge declared. Temporary guardianship to Arthur and Sarah Jensen, pending a full hearing next week. Get me the paperwork, counselor. I'll sign it. It was over. The battle was won. Bear felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He stood up, towering over the broken figures of Peterson and Albright. He and Deacon walked out of the conference room without a backward glance. Downstairs, the bikers were still standing guard. As Bear emerged from the building, a low rumble of approval went through the crowd. He simply raised a hand, a gesture of thanks and dismissal. As if on cue, engines began to turn over. The orderly, disciplined withdrawal began. Half an hour later, Bear and his wife, Sarah, a warm, capable woman with kind eyes that mirrored her husband's, pulled up to Maya's elementary school. Maya was in the principal's office, small and lost in an adult-sized chair. A new social worker, a young man with a harried but sincere expression, was with her. When Maya saw Bear, her eyes widened. He knelt down, bringing his huge frame to her level. He didn't smile, not yet. He just looked at her seriously. "It's over," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "The Carters can't hurt you anymore. You're safe now." He held out his hand. "You're coming home with us, for the first time." Maya looked directly into his eyes. She saw the truth there. She saw safety. She saw the end of the fear. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She reached out her small, trembling hand and placed it in his massive one. Her dignity, so long buried, was being restored. 1 year later, the legacy of that day had woven itself into the fabric of the city. The ripple effects were wider than anyone could have imagined. The investigation into the San Bernardino DCFS, spurred by Judge Miller's unyielding oversight, had become a full-blown state inquiry. Director Peterson was fired. Ms. Albright and 2 of her supervisors faced criminal charges for falsifying state documents and reckless endangerment. The scandal forced a top-to-bottom reform of the foster care system across 3 counties, with new oversight committees and a whistleblower protection program for teachers and neighbors. The Carters were convicted. Their house was sold to pay the fines and restitution ordered by the court. They were a forgotten footnote in a story that had become a local legend. The most profound change, however, was in a quiet suburban home with a well-tended garden. Maya Jensen, she had insisted on taking their name, was no longer a ghost. She was a vibrant, laughing 10-year-old who loved astronomy, peanut butter sandwiches, and the deep, rumbling sound of her dad's motorcycle pulling into the driveway. The adoption had been finalized 6 months earlier in Judge Miller's courtroom. The entire San Bernardino charter, all in clean leather and their Sunday best, had filled the gallery, their silent, supportive presence leaving the bailiff speechless. Sarah, Maya's mom, had helped her heal the invisible wounds with patience and a nurse's steady care. Bear, her dad, had taught her how to be strong, not with fists, but with courage and conviction. He was teaching her how to ride a small dirt bike in the backyard, his huge hands gently guiding the handlebars. The club itself had been transformed in the public eye. They were still feared by some, but to many, they were now a symbol of an unlikely form of justice. Their annual Toys for Tots charity ride was rebranded. It was now Maya's Ride for Forgotten Angels. The event exploded in popularity. That year, over 2,000 motorcycles from all over the West Coast descended on San Bernardino, not as an intimidating force, but as a massive, joyful parade. They brought not just toys, but checks for a new foundation the club had started in Maya's name. The foundation provided pro bono legal services and independent investigators for suspected cases of child abuse that were stalled in the system. Deacon ran it, his sharp legal mind now aimed permanently at the heart of the bureaucracy. The final scene of that legacy played out on a sun-drenched Saturday morning. Maya stood on a small stage in the center of the park, the staging ground for the ride. She was wearing jeans, boots, and a small, custom-made leather vest. It was an exact replica of her dad's, but on the back was not a skull, but a single, intricately stitched white angel wing. Bear stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He looked out at the endless sea of chrome and leather, at the families and news crews and city officials who had come to show their support. He leaned down and whispered in Maya's ear, "You ready?" She looked up at him, her face bright with a confidence that had been bought with courage and love. She nodded, then stepped up to the microphone. Her voice, no longer small and reedy but clear and strong, carried over the massive crowd. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "A year ago I was alone. Today I have a family of 2,000. Let's ride for the kids who are still waiting." A deafening roar of applause and engines answered her. Bear picked her up and settled her into the custom sidecar attached to his gleaming motorcycle. As he kicked the engine to life, he caught his reflection in the chrome of his handlebars. He saw himself, and he saw the smiling face of his daughter, looking out at the world, safe and fearless, reflected right beside him. The protector and the protected, now just a father and his child, leading a legion of angels on a ride for justice.